I thought I would tell you a bit about our conference, and we've done it for 4 years now. The idea is to focus on connecting to evolving business and political environments. And this is our school's signature event. And I think it's also important to recognize the work of so many people who helped put this event together. I want to acknowledge, first of all, some colleagues from Rutgers University, Farag Landana and Sharon Leiden from Rutgers. Thank you for coming today. And we have Mike Yakubov, am I pronouncing that correctly? From William Patterson University. Thank you. And now I'd like to acknowledge those in our really awesome network. Dolores Atalo, who's a Rutgers alum, by the way. She introduced me to Maureen Nevin Duffy, who's on the panel, and Amir Robertson, who's here, right here, as well. And just to name a couple of people that are associated with the conference, Gilbert Gachelian, I recognize your photo, Gilbert, and Ashish Parmar, who will be serving on a panel with Katya Passerini, who's here. Thank you, Katya. And thanks to the faculty who are inviting their students to come to make this a successful day. And I really appreciate that. And some of our faculty are here. Shanti Gopalakrishnan, who's here, Jack Wagner, and Ellen Thomas. And our Associate Dean, Lisa Axe, is here, and Professor Shekna Silla, and Cesar Bandera. There was, I thought I saw Homer Bonitsis. There he is, Homer. And did I overlook anyone? Wayne Fox? Just acknowledge everybody. Jim Shorn, who's on a panel as well. Thank you. And Anthony Arismendi, one of our alums who will be helping to shepherd the day along. Alan Wink, did I mention Alan's name already? I did not. And again, thanks to everybody who made this a very successful event. And now I would like to introduce to you our keynote speaker. His name is Ramu Damodaran, and he is Chief of Academic Impact and Secretary, General Assembly Committee on Information for the United Nations. I was able to get such a fantastic speaker through our network. Suresh Kumar, one of your friends, suggested you, and thank you for accepting our invitation. We greatly appreciate that. In addition to heading the United Nations Academic Impact Initiative, Mr. Damodaran's responsibilities also encompass outreach to and partnerships with the non-governmental academic and private sector constituencies in the context of the 70th anniversary commemoration of the United Nations. He also serves as Secretary of the United Nations General Assembly Committee on Information. His earlier assignments with the organization have included the Departments of Peacekeeping and Special Political Questions, as well as the Executive Office of the Secretary General. While a member of the Indian Foreign Service, he served as Executive Assistant to the Prime Minister of India from 1991 to 1994, and was promoted to the rank of Ambassador in 1997. And prior to joining national government service, he worked extensively in Indian mass media, including television, radio, and print publications, including as a news anchor and disc jockey. His radio feature, Echoes of a Generation, was awarded the Asia Pacific Broadcasting Union Prize. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Ramu Damodaran.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elaine. Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you, Dr. Caudle, for that wonderful tone setting, which I think I'm going to be completely off the mark if I try to respond to that, but I would like to incorporate some elements. You know, one of the pleasures as well as perils about working for the United Nations is that people expect that you can talk about anything and invite you to do that. And about a year ago, I got a telephone call from something called the Health and Hospitals Corporation in New York, and it was a very crackly telephone line. And I heard this lady saying she wanted me to come and speak to them a couple of weeks later. And I said, what do you want me to speak about? And I heard her say press freedom, which is certainly something that the United Nations and I personally am involved with since I'm in the communications department. So I said, certainly I'll be there, and I turned up 2 weeks later And a very formidable lady greeted me and said, "Are you sure you know something about this topic?" So I said, "Well, I'll do my best." So she still regarded me rather quizzically, took me up to the room, filled like this, and introduced me as Ramu Damodaran from the United Nations, who was, for the next half an hour, going to speak on breastfeeding. So when I got Elaine's telephone message asking me to come here, I really thought there must be some mistake because, quite frankly, I'm the last surviving technologically illiterate Indian. So I'm not really sure if I should be here in the first place, but since you've given me this opportunity, I would like to be with you, learn from you, and share some thoughts with you, because I think the one thing that clearly came through in the introduction that we had from Dr. Caudle and in the Provost's remarks, and indeed in the conversations that you'll have through the day, is that you can think of a flat world, of an even world, in the phrase of a playing field of opportunity. But I think it's also important to think of it as flat in the sense of one which absorbs and disperses. And I'm sure there's some law of physics which relates to this, which I, being a completely humanities student, cannot quite quote. But the idea being that if you were to drop water on a globe or a sphere, it will flow off and will not stain the entire globe. While if you were to drop water upon a level surface, upon a flat surface, then the water disperses. And if you extend that metaphor, what it really means is that something which affects a particular community, either for bad or for good, will inevitably affect communities around it and disperse to other parts of the world. I think we've seen this very dramatically in the last couple of months in the instance of disease, in particular Ebola. We've seen this in the context of natural disasters and how their impact is never geographically contained, but goes far beyond geography. We have seen this in the sense of the adventure of entrepreneurship and cooperation, in the fact if one business opportunity, as you said, sir, comes to a particular community or part of the world, that opportunity is seized upon by another community elsewhere. And if you look at the flatness, if you will, of the earth in that sense, you realize, I think, two elements. That there is a flatness, but it is also, as the normal earth or the physical earth is, it's a flatness which is punctuated by physical features. There are mountains, there are rivers, there are gorges. And to navigate this flat landscape, you have to make your way across these. And this, I would submit to you, is where your genius, your talent, your imagination, your creativity come in. Your ability to build bridges across rivers that would daunt you, your ability to drill tunnels through the mountains which would otherwise hinder you, your ability to create alternative routes when landslides have affected the nearest navigable path before you. That is really the power of imagination and innovation over forces which, until a few decades ago, we could not really think of controlling. Elaine mentioned my involvement with the 70th anniversary of the United Nations, which we are already in the midst of commemoration. The actual year is 2015, but we thought that we would start it this year because this is really, in a sense, the 70th year. And when I was looking up the history of the United Nations, I came across a very interesting and unexpected fact that the very first resolution that the United Nations adopted, the United Nations General Assembly adopted, and this was in January 1946, was titled, "The Problems Created by the Discovery of Atomic Energy." And I think it's relevant for us to think of that because for this body, which really came into being essentially as a political instrument of collective security, to have at its very first session realized the enormity of what had happened 6 months earlier in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not purely from the disarmament or political or strategic or security point of view, but from the purely technological and scientific point of view. In other words, trying to reconcile science and reason, or perhaps to be more fair to science, trying to reconcile politics and the pursuit of politics with the wisdom and magnanimity of science and technology. And I think since then, this has, in a sense, set course for what the United Nations has tried to do. Until about a quarter of a century ago, the role of science and technology, as far as the United Nations was concerned, was really fairly limited because it was considered something somewhat arcane or abstract. But then a remarkable thing happened, and this is really, I would say, almost precisely 25 years ago, and then over the 90s to the millennium that we are now in. And that is the assertion of democracy around the world, largely through the efforts of countries or the examples of countries like the country that I'm proud to come from, India, and the country I'm proud to now live in, the United States. So you had countries at the United Nations which really were, to put it in plain English, afraid of their people. They needed to be re-elected to political office. Governments needed that. And so when they came to the United Nations, they would no longer hide behind a doctrine of being nationally sovereign, saying this does not affect you. And in the process, and this is where, again, a community like this comes in the process, this grand alliance came of political impulse, the democratic impulse, and the anxiety of leaders to be true and accountable to their peoples, and the wisdom of scholarship. And that wisdom of scholarship was able to define for the United Nations very precise goals and objectives which could be scientifically assured. And I mention this difference to you because it was a transformation, if you will, from a United Nations which was really aspirational. It exulted in moral or ethical values. It spoke of them. It exhorted them. But it had never brought to them the science of feasibility. To give you a very specific instance, it is all very well to say that every human being has the right to food and livelihood. That is what I would call a truth, but an exhortation. It's a vastly different thing to get people who can study agriculture, who can study economics, who can study physical science, come to you and say, all things being equal, if governments put their mind to it, the number of people who are poor and hungry in this world can be halved in the next 15 years, because that becomes a scientific fact, a scientific postulate. And where the catch, of course, comes in the phrase, all things being equal, because we did define these goals in the year 1999-2000, and as we approach the 15-year benchmark, in many parts of the world, we have succeeded remarkably in realizing them. In other parts of the world, we have not, and many of the goals are still universally short of realization. But this, again, think of the landscape of the last 15 years, which I dare say is in the lifetime of all of us in this room. Think of the unexpected occurrences which deterred us along the path. We had, less than a year after the Millennium Development Goals were adopted, we had the whole global political and strategic landscapes change with 9/11 a few miles away from here. We had the tsunami in Asia in 2004. We had SARS and the avian flu and Ebola in parts of the world over these 15 years. You had natural disasters, the earthquakes in China, in Chile, the hurricane in New Orleans. So at every point in time, things are not going to remain equal. And our wisdom on this flat earth is in trying to fashion goals not as destinations, but as directions. In other words, this is the path which governments and their allies take with them. And this, in a sense, to go back to my principal area of work, is what led us to create the United Nations Academic Impact. The idea being that every university, every faculty member, every university chief executive, and every student is already studying, working, doing something which makes a positive impact on the world and hence on the United Nations. Dr. Caudle spoke of corporate social responsibility. We try to term it as intellectual social responsibility. And it's not something which is particularly new or hard to attain, because as I said, it's part of our normal discourse. And how is it? Let me try and give you some instances based not so much on the goals that we have, in a sense, put behind us, but the goals that we're now reaching towards. In less than a year from now, in the September of 2015, governments around the world will debate and adopt a new set of goals for the world, taking us to the year 2030, another 15-year period. We're not quite sure what these goals will be called. As a shorthand, they're often referred to as Sustainable Development Goals, because the Millennium Development Goals gave us very precise and, as I suggested, scientifically proven destinations to work towards. What these goals will do is to give us that immediate perspective, that spell of time of 15 years, but also ensure that they can be sustainable beyond that date. And exactly to go back to the phrase of the Brundtland report, that in achieving these goals in the immediacy of the first third of the 21st century, we will not be denying a chance for these goals to be furthered or other goals to be achieved by generations who come after them. And what I would like to suggest to you, and I would ask you to think for yourself, is how each one of these goals, while you talk about them at a stratospheric plane as something which is an ideal, can really be translated into day-to-day actions of which each one of us is capable, and more important, day-to-day actions which most of us are already doing. Let's take the first goal, which is to end poverty in all its forms. How do universities and educational institutions come into it? Let me tell you the story, if you're not familiar with it already, of a student of NJIT. His name is Kevin Prohl. He went a year or so ago to Ecuador. He worked with a community there, building a water system to be able to irrigate villages who until then had no clean drinking water. He had, and his team had, no advanced technology with them. They used what we would call, in effect, primitive instruments, primitive tools, to be able to drill and fetch that water. But in being able to use these indigenous, the instruments that he found in Ecuador, and working with the population over 6 months, Kevin was able to give 6 entire villages in that part of the world access to water, and through the access to water, and access to livelihood and time. Time was the critical thing here, because the time that they were otherwise spending traveling miles to be able to bring water, they could now expend on a productive career and curtailing their poverty. So ending poverty is not as distant or unreal. It is broken down into examples like Kevin's, which I would like to share with you. The second Sustainable Development Goal is a goal of eradicating hunger wherever it occurs in the world. Again, let me cite to you 2 students from this institution, Daniel Boston and Manoob Thalassia. They worked on a mobile application called Mob Crops. Now, this particular app allows farmers in any part of the world to be able to communicate to markets and to other farmers, to be able to see where their produce could be best marketed, where it could reach, and where food wastage could be kept to its minimum. One of the greatest causes of global hunger today is not the inadequacy of food, but the extremely antiquated nature of our storage systems, despite all the advances we have technologically made. And through this app, people are able to immediately connect produce that is readily available with the markets that are going to accept them. That is what I mean by technology coming in for an otherwise lofty United Nations ideal. You take the third sustainable goal, that of health, and another student from NJIT, Nikhil Kaushal, who won a Microsoft I think it was called the Hackathon Challenge, and devised again an app by which a cellular phone could become a video transmitter, and put this to use in situations of epidemic and disease. And as he says himself, using this in Sierra Leone in a situation of disease of Ebola, could be able to immediately connect the caregiver, the needer of care, and more important, the large community of the frightened who are just watching on, not knowing what the implications of this disease are going to be upon them. So again, you have something brought down to the level. A fourth goal, and this is a wonderful goal that the United Nations finally realized, called lifelong learning. Because until now, the first set of goals only talked about primary education. But now, governments realize that they have to go beyond primary school to universities, and indeed beyond universities into life itself. And here, at NJIT, where you have collaborative doctorate programs, where you have the MBA executive program that Elaine leads and which allows people to work in conjunction with their careers, where you have non-credited graduate courses, that, to my mind, is the lifelong learning which can really animate this particular community. You go on beyond that to another goal, that of gender equality and of gender empowerment. Again, let me give you the names of 3 students, 2 former students, 1 current student of this institution: Maria, Maritina, and Vincia Jackson. They all came from African American backgrounds to this university under the Equal Opportunity Program and excelled here. Maria and Maritina, I believe, are already working as a dentist and a veterinarian, respectively. Vincia is still here. But the fact that they were able to overcome both their social background and, let's be honest about it, their gender, and come here thanks to the wisdom of this institution and the state and their abilities, shows that that idea of gender empowerment is as necessary in an advanced country as the United States is, as it is in parts of the world where we would consider it to be a social factor of life. Come to the next question of the Sustainable Development Goals, water management. And you think of this wonderful partnership that has been forged by 3 great institutions, NJIT, Rowan University, and Drexel University, working together on programs of water, which would not only assure the provision of the commodity itself, of water itself, but also direct that water to areas of public health and to the area of energy, which is the next Sustainable Development Goal. Just 2 days ago at the School of Architecture and Design on this campus, we had a conference on energy and its relation to the unfamiliar disciplines, if you will, of architecture and design. And at that conference, President Joel Bloom said that it's a contradiction in terms. We think of energy as something which is fast-paced and sweeping, but here we are in a situation where energy is just not keeping up with the demands that we reasonably have of it. But in a sense, what is happening, and this is the other factor I would like you to keep in mind, the advances of technology are only enabling us to do swifter and better what the human mind has already been capable of, even in a technologically less advanced age. In my part of India, in Kerala, more than half a century ago, an American architect called Laurie Baker came and designed an entire campus, a university called the Center for Development. And all the houses in that extremely tropical and hot part of the world were constructed in a fashion that were both energy efficient and climate resilient and to put it quite simply, cool. So what Laurie Baker's mind was able to conjure in the late 60s and 70s, we are now able to enhance and bring to more parts of the world through the technology that you command, which allied with the minds that you already possess, can make progress inevitable. If you go beyond that to the next step, you come to the question of what I would really call, and we talked about water, about marine preservation. How do we assure that the waters of the world are kept, first of all, clean and unpolluted, and allow marine life there to flourish. Again, you have a professor from NJIT, Richard Farber, who has gone to China and worked on the Zhangzhou Lake there, and through a system called wetland buffering, has been able to transform clean water from that river into the Yangtze River. That, to my mind, is a practical innovation that technology has made possible. Another area of importance is, of course, the terrestrial system, preserving the Earth itself. And we have this wonderful global project called EarthCube, of which NJIT is a critical part, which really works on the dynamics of the connections between solar power and solar energy and the sun, and the preservation of forms of life on Earth, whether human life, animal life, or plant and vegetable life. In other words, preserving our terra firma. You go beyond that to the question of how exactly we are going to deal with what, in a sense, are infrastructural problems of the 21st century world. Here again, you have a collaborative arrangement between NJIT and the Cement Corporation of Thailand, the Siam Cement Corporation, where each of them will fuse the $100 million each has for research funds in the creation of a robust collaboration program, which is going to talk about how you can make transportation of goods, the storage of goods, and the transmission of energy and power, the essentials of infrastructure, wastewater management, another essential of infrastructure, possible. That is the degree of collaboration. You take this a step further and think of another one of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is to try and defend sustainable consumption and production patterns around the world, to link the producer with the consumer. An alumnus of NJIT, Donald Cronin, I think he graduated in 1975, has started a company called Alternative Technologies, which is working precisely on this, how it's possible, and this again relates to what I had referred to earlier in the context of food storage, but storage is a problem not only in terms of perishable commodities, but in case of other industrial and commercial products as well. To be able to transform these products, store them, and then make them marketable and transported across the human chain. That is another specific evidence of the benefit of technological research and innovation. Go a step further. We have another Sustainable Development goal called Sustainable Cities, and how you're going to make cities resilient and the people who live in these cities actually able to work within them. And this requires, again, a sense of understanding of what communities in cities are able to command. How do people react to each other? How do they deal with the urban infrastructure? And here, in this university, we have a Professor Simon Grenier, who's working on something called swarm intelligence, which uses the dynamics of something like a colony of small ants and how they regulate their own lives within a community to transform that or transpose that to the effects of a city as a whole. So these are the instances which I would like to share with you of where your work, your academic work, actually becomes what the United Nations is trying to do. And none of this needs to be particularly esoteric. You take something as lofty as a goal of creating more inclusive societies. There's so much to be done there. But I think one factor that all of us realize is, and it's a small factor but an important factor, that militates against inclusive society is the occasional individual who, because he possesses a weapon or a gun, is able to cause havoc and fear. And again, as a newspaper said some weeks ago, will technology become the new gun control of 2014? In other words, can we use technology, and there's work being done in this institution on that I know, to be able to make the use of guns more controlled and easier so that it does not lend itself being misused in the wrong hands. So if you see this over arc of technology, and I began with the instance of Kevin Prohl, and if you go full circle, I was talking about Kevin in Ecuador, but if you go full circle and translate that one experience, a finite local experience, if you will, into an element of global partnership, then you come to the other immense possibilities that the technology that Dr. Caudle shared with us can yield. And again, we have a group called Engineers Without Borders. We have Dr. J. Migora in this university, in I think the geoscience department, who's been working in Sri Lanka on a project called phytocapping. And the idea being that you take landfills, and the normal way that you deal with landfills in the developing world is just to cover them and put them out of sight. But that does not prevent them releasing methane gas, being environmentally harmful, quite apart from being unsightly and malodorous. What he has done is to, instead of putting a thin layer of subterfuge over it, actually plant native species, botanical species on these, so you are able to convert that methane into a much less lethal carbon dioxide, and also be able to, in effect, create a green landscape rather than a landfill. Now, this is a project begun here at NJIT, taken to Sri Lanka, and now there's interest all over South Asia in it. The same organization here, Engineers Without Borders, and Dr. Migora, have worked with creating a sand filtration water system for Haiti. This is the power of the technology you command and the global impact that it can make. So what I've been trying to share with you, as I said, in a sense, as an imposter at this conference, is that maybe in a sense I'm not an imposter at all, because what I do, even if it's not personally technological in the sense of my abilities or my prowess, are an ability to understand and to try and seize the technological moment of which you're all proud possessors. Because with that, you can really transform the immediacy of your research project, which is what your immediate preoccupation would naturally be, but beyond that, the lives and futures of people on this planet. I was struck by the remarks of the graduation speaker at NJIT a couple of months ago, Indra Hernandez, who said that the one thing that she had learned at NJIT was to convert negatives into positives. And if you look at that in terms of physics or electricity, you realize that there are really very few solely positive particle transmissions or solely negative electron transmissions. Everything either goes together or one or the other. It depends essentially on the conductor. And if you have a conductor like NJIT, with its wealth of academic leadership and scholarship and student talent, then those negative electrons can be changed into the positive. That remains my conviction. Because ultimately, if you think of all that you're doing and the possibilities it has for our world, just reduce it, if you will, to a simple metaphor, which came home to me about a year ago when we had a meeting at the United Nations where people were, including scholars from NJIT, were discussing the consequences of Hurricane Sandy. And there was a woman from Basking Ridge, New Jersey. I think her name was Joan Flynn, and she spoke. And I'll never forget her last two lines, which were, "And so we had to completely rebuild our house. I never realized till then just how much I had loved my home." And I think that's a metaphor for us. We cannot afford to wait till a time when we look back saying, we never quite realized just how much we loved our earth. And if we are able to rebuild it as we live upon it, and to fashion for it and for our lives a future that is worthy of the genius that is in this room, then frankly, the United Nations will have been worth its 70 years. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.